Surviving the food deficit in the USSR wasn't just about getting by. It was about endurance, resilience, and ingenuity. Citizens faced chronic food shortages that shaped everyday life for over 6 decades. How did they cope, and why was food always in short supply? Let's take a closer look at what it was like living under the constant strain of a planned economy. The roots of the food deficit can be traced to the early days of Soviet industrialization. Under Stalin's leadership, starting in the late 1920s, the Soviet government prioritized rapid industrial growth, often at the expense of agriculture. Collectivization, which forced small farmers into state-run farms, led to devastating effects: lower yields and even widespread famines like the Holodomor in Ukraine. Collectivization disrupted traditional farming practices, causing food production to decline drastically. Mismanagement, lack of incentives, and bureaucratic inefficiencies further worsened the situation. The Soviet Union's centrally planned economy controlled every aspect of production and distribution, which meant that even small miscalculations led to major shortages of essential goods, including food. For most citizens, waiting in line was a daily reality. Ration cards, introduced during and after World War II, were used to control and distribute limited amounts of goods, but even with a ration card, you weren't guaranteed to get what you needed. Long lines for basics like bread, butter, and sugar were a constant reminder of the inefficiencies of the system. Of course, when official supply chains failed, black markets flourished. Known as BLAT, informal networks of bartering and trading became crucial to survival. People exchanged goods, favors, or services to get food or essentials. These black markets often operated under the radar and were a lifeline for many Soviet citizens. But not everyone relied on markets. Soviet citizens were also resourceful in other ways. Many families had dachas, small country cottages with plots of land for gardening. These personal vegetable gardens provided families with potatoes, onions, cucumbers, and other crops that helped make up for the lack of available food in state stores. In fact, by the 1980s, these private gardens accounted for nearly 30% of the country's produce. Constant food shortages created an atmosphere of anxiety and stress. For many, the daily hunt for food consumed not just time but mental energy. Citizens developed complex strategies, going from store to store, hoarding supplies when they became available, and forming informal networks to trade goods. Even communal life was affected, as people were forced to collaborate or compete for scarce resources. As the Soviet Union entered its final decade, the situation worsened. Despite Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika reforms, which aimed to restructure the economy and open the country, food shortages intensified. Imports from the West, including grain from the United States, were meant to alleviate the crisis, but they couldn't completely fix the underlying problems. Interestingly, food became more than just a necessity. It was a tool for political control. The government used food supplies to reinforce loyalty to the Communist Party. People who were better connected or lived in major cities like Moscow had access to more and better quality goods. Rural areas, on the other hand, often suffered the worst shortages. In a way, food access reflected social status within the Soviet system. Even with the collapse of the USSR in 1991, the legacy of food shortages lingered. The transition to a market economy brought new challenges: hyperinflation, economic instability, and shifting social structures. But many people continued to rely on the survival strategies they had developed during Soviet times. Even with the collapse of the USSR in 1991, the legacy of food shortages lingered. The transition to a market economy brought new challenges: hyperinflation, economic instability, and shifting social structures. But many people continued to rely on the survival strategies they had developed during Soviet times.